Erick Schonfeld. I'm here at Techonomy with Steve Case, founder of AOL, and now an investor and an advisor to the government and the president in terms of creating jobs. We've been talking a lot about job creation. Growth has been stagnant for a while. What can we do to get job growth going again?
Well, the key thing is focus on entrepreneurship. If you look at the data from the Kauffman Foundation, over the last 3 decades, 40 million jobs have been created by high growth companies, young companies that are growing 20% a year, and it really accounts for all the net job creation. So as a nation, when we want to focus on kind of rebooting the economy and getting jobs going, the job creation engine going again, you got to focus on entrepreneurship. So the Jobs Council that the White House put in place early in the year, chaired by Jeff Immelt, the CEO of GE, laid out an overall set of policies. The part I was particularly focused on was these high growth companies, and we laid out a program in terms of things the private sector can do, things the administration can do, and also things that the Congress needs to do, and we really need to build bipartisan support for an entrepreneurship agenda.
Right, so what are some of your top suggestions in terms of what the government can do? There's only so much the government can do, right? Entrepreneurs have to
ultimately, the private sector entrepreneurs and investors funding entrepreneurs need to take the lead. But the government can have either a positive or a negative impact, and we want to maximize the positive and minimize the negative. So there's 3 particular areas we're trying to focus Congress on. One relates to immigration policy. We're losing the global battle for talent. We actually do a pretty good job of attracting some of the best and brightest in the world to come to our universities and give them PhDs, and then actually force them to leave to go back to their country to create companies that compete with us. It's insane. So we propose things like stapling a green card to those PhDs and actually asking people to stay here, and really having a bias in terms of immigration policy around high-skilled workers, engineers and entrepreneurs who can really be job creators as opposed to job takers. We understand immigration's complicated and sensitive, and there's many facets to it, but focusing on the high-skilled worker piece of it, we think is
so that's
very
everything
important.
from more H-1B visas to startup visas.
There's a half a dozen different components of that, but it all kind of is under the umbrella of kind of winning the global battle for talent. The second relates to access to capital. That there are some sectors that are doing well, and if you're a social media company in Silicon Valley, you're probably doing pretty well. But there's many sectors of the economy and many regions around the nation that are not doing that well, and we're trying to figure out ways to unlock more capital, and some of that is creating incentives. So we recommended allowing crowdfunding of companies that right now it's sort of a gray zone that the SEC technically you have to be an accredited investor to make an investment, but there's some legislation now that basically allows us to, up to a certain level, allows people to make these investments and makes it legal for the companies to accept them. We've also recommended some changes in capital gains that create incentives around early stage investment and also when companies go public. So access to capital would be a second big category. And the third is the regulatory environment. And that's true in different sectors, like in the healthcare sector, the drugs and devices are increasingly moving offshore because of some of the issues with the FDA and the approval process that just takes too long and lacks a certain transparency. So there's things that need to be done there. But one in particular that we're focused on relates to Sarbanes-Oxley and IPOs. That 20 years ago, when AOL went public, most of the companies did relatively small offerings, sort of in the relatively early part of their life cycle. It's gone from essentially 80% of the offerings being under 50 million now to 20% being under 50 million because it's become so much more costly to go public. As a result, a lot of companies never go public, they get sold, and when companies get sold, often the growth of jobs decelerates. When they go public, it accelerates. 90% of jobs are created after companies go public.
So do you want to repeal Sarbanes-Oxley or just not make it, have a higher threshold for when?
Basically have a higher threshold. Sarbanes-Oxley makes sense for large companies. If you're GE or IBM or what have you, and giving investors some transparency, I think makes sense. But it does not make sense to apply the same rules that GE and IBM should be subject to a company with, say, 50 million of revenue. So we basically, and the people who architected Sarbanes-Oxley recognize that, and they actually put a carve out if the market value was $75 million or less, you wouldn't be subjected to, but we need to raise that. We recommended at the Jobs Council $1 billion valuation would be, and there's other legislation. One I saw recently said it should be 350 million. Something above 75 million would result in more companies going public sooner, which then would create more jobs more quickly.
Let's dive into the crowdfunding, because I think people are fascinated with that. You've seen services like Kickstarter, which have created products and even companies, but people don't get shares. It's not like you're actually a shareholder. You're just sort of giving money and you'll get something in return, maybe the product. But you're talking about actually being able to crowdsource the funding where you are a shareholder. And I think the reaction or the counter argument would be, well, then aren't people going to be scammed out of their money?
And there's that risk, which is why the SEC put in the limitations that exist now, where you essentially have to be a accredited investor, and there's a whole disclosure process. But that really, keeps most of the people out of the market, and there are only a small number of people who can qualify, and makes it more difficult for these companies to raise capital. So right now, the way most companies get started is, put money on their credit card and borrow money from friends or family or business colleagues. But there's some point where you need, maybe tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the crowdfunding would allow you to aggregate the investments of a large number of small investors, and we think that would help provide additional access to capital. But to your point, it seemed a little crazy to me that you have to be an accredited investor to invest in a company, but you can go to Las Vegas and lose $10,000 at the table in an hour, and you don't have to be an accredited gambler to do that. So we just think that there should be a recognition that the rules the SEC puts in place make sense, but they shouldn't be one size fits all, and kind of tiering them to the nature of the entrepreneurial
maybe you
growth
should
companies.
have to be an accredited gambler.
Probably should, but that's a whole different topic.